Istanbul, Turkey, April 7, 2007, 3:47 in the afternoon. A man in his mid-30s walks down Istiklal Street, one of the busiest pedestrian corridors in the world. He's carrying a brown envelope tucked inside his jacket. His name is Rashid, though that's probably not his real name, and he's about to make a mistake that will cost him everything. He stops at a street food stand where smoke rises from a charcoal grill loaded with skewered lamb. The vendor, a Turkish man with a thick mustache and worn apron, greets him in perfect Istanbul dialect. Rashid orders 2 lamb kebabs and a glass of tea. The vendor works the grill with practiced efficiency, turning the meat, brushing it with oil, speaking casually about the weather and the crowds. To anyone watching, this is just another transaction in a city of 14 million people. Just a hungry customer and a hard-working vendor. But here's what makes this absolutely insane. The vendor isn't Turkish. He isn't even a real street food vendor. He's a Mossad operative who's been running this kebab stand for 18 months, and the envelope Rashid is carrying contains instructions for a weapons shipment that Israeli intelligence has been tracking across 3 continents. And here's the craziest part. Rashid has no idea. He thinks he's safely operating in Istanbul, a city where Israeli intelligence can't touch him because Turkey doesn't allow Mossad operations on their soil. He thinks his tradecraft is solid because he's using face-to-face meetings instead of phones that can be intercepted. He thinks stopping at this random food stand is just a natural part of blending into the urban environment. He's wrong on every count. This is the story of one of the most patient surveillance operations in modern intelligence history. How Mossad created an entire street food business from scratch to track enemy couriers in hostile territory. How they invested 18 months building a cover so deep that nobody suspected anything. How they trained an operative to become an actual expert at grilling Turkish kebabs so his cover would withstand scrutiny from neighboring vendors who'd been doing this work for decades, and how one street corner in Istanbul became the center of an operation that would expose an entire terrorist logistics network. The vendor hands Rashid his kebabs wrapped in flatbread. Rashid pays. He takes his food and walks away, disappearing into the river of tourists and shoppers flowing down Istiklal Street. The vendor watches him go while serving his next customer, a German tourist asking about prices. Nobody notices anything unusual, and that's exactly the point. Let me take you back to November 2005, 18 months before that encounter on Istiklal Street. Mossad headquarters, Tel Aviv. A briefing room where senior operations officers are discussing a problem that's been frustrating Israeli intelligence for over 2 years. Hamas and Hezbollah have figured out something clever. They're using Istanbul as a logistics hub for moving money, weapons, and intelligence between their cells in the Middle East and their operatives in Europe. And they're doing it in ways that Israeli intelligence can't easily penetrate. Here's why Istanbul works so well for terrorist organizations. Turkey is a NATO member and has diplomatic relations with Israel, but it's also a Muslim-majority country with significant public sympathy for Palestinian causes. The Turkish government officially cooperates with Israeli intelligence on some counter-terrorism issues, but they absolutely will not allow Mossad to conduct operations on Turkish soil. If Israeli agents get caught running surveillance or recruitment operations in Istanbul, it creates a diplomatic crisis. The Turkish government has to respond publicly. Relationships get damaged. So Hamas and Hezbollah use Istanbul as a safe zone. They move couriers through the city. They set up meetings in crowded public places. They transfer funds through Turkish banks and exchange houses. They know Israeli intelligence has limited reach there, and they exploit that limitation systematically. For Mossad, this creates an intelligence blind spot in one of the most strategically important cities in the region. Istanbul sits at the crossroads between Europe and the Middle East. It's a transit hub where East meets West. Millions of people flow through it constantly, which makes surveillance incredibly difficult, even if you could operate openly. And the couriers who move through Istanbul aren't amateurs. They're trained in tradecraft. They avoid electronic communications that can be intercepted. They use dead drops instead of direct meetings. They blend into the massive crowds. They change routes constantly. They're specifically trained to operate in urban environments where traditional surveillance methods break down. Israeli intelligence has tried multiple approaches. They've worked with Turkish counterparts, sharing information when Turkish authorities are willing to cooperate. But that cooperation is limited and politically sensitive. They've used technical surveillance, monitoring communications networks, and financial transactions. But the couriers avoid phones and use cash, which leaves minimal digital footprints. They've attempted to insert agents using false identities, but those operations were compromised when Turkish intelligence detected foreigners conducting suspicious activities. Every traditional method had failed or produced insufficient intelligence. And the problem was getting worse because terrorist organizations were increasing their use of Istanbul as operational territory. The solution came from an operations officer named Yosef, though that's not his real name. He'd spent 15 years running surveillance operations across Europe and the Middle East, and he understood one fundamental principle about effective intelligence work. The best cover isn't something you create overnight. It's something you build slowly, authentically, until it becomes indistinguishable from reality. He proposed something that sounded insane to the senior officers reviewing his plan. Create a street food vendor from scratch. Not just give an agent a fake identity and have him pretend to sell kebabs. Actually establish a legitimate business. Get proper permits. Build supplier relationships. Develop a reputation. Become part of Istanbul's street food ecosystem so thoroughly that nobody would ever suspect the vendor was anything other than what he appeared to be. The proposal required resources that most intelligence operations never get. It would take at least a year, possibly longer, to establish the cover. It would require significant funding because running a legitimate business meant actual overhead costs. And it would tie up a trained operative for an extended period, doing work that had nothing to do with intelligence collection, at least initially. But the more senior officers considered it, the more sense it made. If terrorist couriers were using Istanbul because they felt safe there, the only way to penetrate their operations was to be so deeply embedded in the environment that you became invisible. Not an outsider trying to blend in, an actual part of the landscape that nobody would think to question. They approved the operation. The first step was selecting the right operative. They needed someone who could pass as Turkish, which meant either Turkish ancestry or years living in Turkey. They needed someone with patience because this operation would require sustained, boring work before producing any intelligence value. And they needed someone who could actually learn to run a food stand well enough to fool neighboring vendors who'd been doing this work for decades. They found their candidate, a Mossad officer whose family had emigrated from Turkey to Israel 3 generations ago. He spoke Turkish fluently. He understood the culture intimately, and he had the temperament for long-term undercover work. They sent him to train with actual Turkish kebab masters. Not in Turkey, where his presence might be noticed, but in Turkish communities in Germany and Austria, where he could learn traditional preparation methods, grilling techniques, and the social customs around Turkish street food culture. He spent 4 months learning his craft. How to select meat, how to season it properly. By April 2007, the operation had been running for 18 months. The kebab stand on Istiklal Street had become exactly what Mossad intended, a completely unremarkable part of Istanbul's street food landscape. The operative, who'd taken the name Mehmet for his cover identity, had served thousands of customers. He'd developed relationships with neighboring vendors who considered him a colleague. He'd negotiated with suppliers, dealt with city inspectors, and handled all the mundane challenges that real business owners face. He'd become invisible through authenticity, and then Rashid appeared. Mossad's surveillance network had been tracking him for 6 weeks. He was a known Hamas courier who moved money and documents between cells in Lebanon and operatives in Germany. Intelligence analysis suggested he used Istanbul as a transit point, but they didn't know his specific routes or meeting locations. Until he walked down Istiklal Street and stopped at the kebab stand. Mehmet recognized him immediately from surveillance photos he'd memorized, but he didn't react. He simply greeted Rashid like any other customer, took his order, and began preparing the food. While the lamb grilled, Mehmet observed everything with the trained attention of an intelligence officer who'd spent years learning to notice details that ordinary people miss. Rashid wasn't just buying food, he was conducting reconnaissance. He stood at the stand longer than necessary, scanning faces in the crowd. He made brief eye contact with a man in a leather jacket standing 20 meters away. He checked his watch twice, comparing the time against some internal schedule. And, most importantly, he kept touching the envelope inside his jacket, a nervous gesture that suggested whatever he was carrying had significant value. Mehmet served the kebabs, accepted payment, and watched Rashid walk away. Then he served his next customer, a German tourist, while mentally recording every detail of what he'd just witnessed. That evening, he transmitted an encrypted message through a secure channel back to Tel Aviv. The message was brief. Target confirmed at the location. Brown envelope, approximately 20 by 25 centimeters. Made eye contact with possible handler, male, approximately 40 years old, leather jacket, positioned at grid reference, previously discussed. Target displayed counter-surveillance behavior consistent with pre-meeting reconnaissance. Assessment is that this location will be used for future exchange. Recommend continued observation. The response came back within 2 hours. Maintain cover. Continue normal operations. Do not deviate from established pattern. Additional surveillance assets being positioned in surrounding area. Operation entering active phase. 18 months of preparation were about to pay off. Mossad moved assets into position around Istiklal Street with the kind of precision that comes from years of operational experience. But they couldn't flood the area with Israeli agents. That would risk exposure and defeat the entire purpose of having Mehmet embedded as the street vendor. Instead, they used what intelligence professionals call a layered surveillance approach, where multiple independent elements create overlapping coverage without any single element being obvious. They rented an apartment overlooking Istiklal Street through a shell company registered in Cyprus. The apartment's windows provided direct sight lines to Mehmet's kebab stand and the surrounding area. They installed high-resolution cameras with telephoto lenses that could capture facial details from 200 meters away. The cameras operated continuously, recording everyone who passed through that section of street. They positioned a technical surveillance team in a parked van 3 blocks away. The van looked like a commercial delivery vehicle, complete with company logos and legitimate business registration. Inside, 2 Mossad technical specialists monitored radio frequencies and cellular signals in the area, looking for patterns that might indicate communication between Rashid and his contacts. They recruited a local asset, a Turkish shopkeeper who owned a clothing store near the kebab stand. This person wasn't told they were working for Israeli intelligence. They believed they were providing information to a European security company investigating credit card fraud. They simply reported unusual behavior or individuals who seemed to be conducting surveillance of their own. The shopkeeper had no idea their observations were feeding into an Israeli intelligence operation, and Mehmet continued his daily routine without any visible change. He arrived at his stand every morning at 6:30. He prepared his ingredients, set up his grill, and began serving customers by 7:15. He worked until 8 in the evening, 6 days a week, maintaining the exact schedule he'd followed for 18 months. To his neighboring vendors, to his regular customers, to anyone watching, nothing had changed. But now every interaction was being documented. Every face that appeared near his stand was being photographed and run through facial recognition databases. Every vehicle that parked nearby was having its license plate recorded and tracked. The surveillance net was invisible but comprehensive. 4 days after Rashid's first appearance, he came back. It was April 11, 2007. 2:20 in the afternoon. He approached the kebab stand from the opposite direction this time, coming from the western end of Istiklal Street instead of the east. Different approach route, same destination. Mehmet saw him coming and began preparing lamb kebabs before Rashid even reached the stand. The gesture looked like good customer service, remembering a returning customer's preference. Actually, it was tactical positioning. By starting the food preparation early, Mehmet ensured Rashid would have to wait at the stand for several minutes while the meat grilled, giving surveillance cameras maximum opportunity to document who appeared nearby. Rashid ordered the same meal as his previous visit, 2 lamb kebabs and tea. He paid in Turkish lira, counting out exact change. While he waited for his food, he did something he hadn't done during his first visit. He made casual conversation. He asked Mehmet how long he'd been running the stand. Mehmet answered truthfully. 18 months. He asked where Mehmet was from originally. Mehmet said Gaziantep, a city in southeastern Turkey known for its culinary traditions. This was part of his cover story, detailed enough to withstand casual questioning, but vague enough to avoid creating verifiable claims that could be checked. Rashid nodded, seeming satisfied. Then he asked the question that made Mehmet realize this wasn't just friendly conversation. He asked if Mehmet was always at this location, if the stand operated on a consistent schedule, if someone could find him here reliably on specific days and times. Mehmet kept his expression neutral while his mind processed the implications. Rashid wasn't just buying food, he was vetting the location for use as a meeting point. He needed to know if this stand would be here consistently because he was planning to use it as a landmark or reference point for future operations. Mehmet confirmed his schedule. 6 days a week, 7 in the morning until 8 at night. Closed on Mondays. Same location for the past 18 months. No plans to move. Rashid thanked him, took his food, and walked away. But this time, he didn't leave the area immediately. He walked 40 meters down the street and stopped at a small cafe. He sat at an outdoor table where he had clear sight lines back to the kebab stand. He ate slowly while watching the flow of people and occasionally checking his phone. Mehmet continued serving customers while peripherally tracking Rashid's position. The surveillance cameras in the apartment overlooking the street were capturing everything. The technical team in the van was monitoring for electronic signals. And then the handler appeared. A man in his mid-40s, wearing a dark blue jacket and jeans, approached the cafe where Rashid was sitting. He didn't sit at Rashid's table. Instead, he sat at an adjacent table, one position over, close enough for conversation, but maintaining the appearance of being separate customers. The two men didn't acknowledge each other initially. The handler ordered coffee. He lit a cigarette. He pulled out a newspaper and began reading. To casual observers, they were simply two people sitting near each other in a crowded cafe. But Mehmet, watching from his grill, noticed what ordinary people wouldn't. The handler's newspaper was folded to show specific pages facing Rashid's direction. Rashid's phone was on his table, positioned at an angle that would allow the handler to see the screen if anything was displayed. Neither man spoke directly to the other, but information was clearly being exchanged through these subtle channels. The meeting lasted exactly 12 minutes. Then, Rashid stood, left money on his table, and walked away heading east down Istiklal Street. The handler remained seated for another 3 minutes before standing and walking in the opposite direction, heading west. They had successfully conducted a meeting in public without any obvious interaction that could be identified by surveillance teams watching for traditional meeting patterns. But Mossad's cameras had captured both their faces in high resolution. Within 2 hours, facial recognition analysis identified the handler. His name was Kamal Nassar, a Lebanese national with confirmed ties to Hezbollah's External Operations Division. He'd been photographed at a Hezbollah training facility in the Bekaa Valley 3 years earlier. He'd traveled extensively through Europe over the past 18 months, always using legitimate cover as a textile import-export businessman. And now Israeli intelligence knew he was running courier operations through Istanbul. This was significant intelligence. Nassar wasn't a foot soldier. He was a mid-level coordinator who managed logistics for operations across multiple countries. If Mossad could track his activities, they could potentially map an entire network of operatives and identify operations before they were executed. The question was what Rashid had delivered in that envelope and what instructions he might have received in return. The surveillance team reviewed the footage frame by frame. They noticed something they'd missed during real-time observation. When Rashid left the cafe, he'd left his newspaper on the table. 30 seconds after he departed, a different person, a young woman who'd been sitting 3 tables away, stood up and walked past Rashid's table. As she passed, she picked up the newspaper he'd left behind. This was a dead drop in plain sight. Rashid had placed something inside the newspaper, probably the envelope he'd been carrying. The woman had retrieved it without any direct interaction between them. The handler, Nassar, had been there to confirm the drop was executed properly and to observe whether anyone was following Rashid or showing unusual interest in his activities. By the time Mossad's surveillance team realized what had happened, the woman had already disappeared into the crowds on Istiklal Street. They'd been so focused on Rashid and Nassar that they'd missed the actual courier, who'd taken possession of whatever Rashid had delivered. This was professional tradecraft. Hamas and Hezbollah had trained their operatives well. They weren't using simple meetings where evidence could be photographed directly. They were using layered protocols with multiple participants, each handling one stage of the transfer, making it extremely difficult for surveillance teams to track the entire chain. But Mehmet had seen her. From his position at the kebab stand, he'd had a clear view of the cafe and had noticed the woman pick up the newspaper. He couldn't follow her without abandoning his cover, but he provided a detailed description through his evening intelligence report. Over the next 3 weeks, Mossad observed the pattern repeat itself 4 more times. Different couriers, different days, but always following the same basic protocol. A courier would arrive at Istiklal Street, stop at Mehmet's kebab stand or one of the nearby shops, then proceed to the cafe, where they'd conduct a dead drop using newspapers, magazines, or shopping bags left on tables and retrieved by other operatives. Nassar, the handler, appeared during 3 of these 4 operations, always maintaining distance from the actual couriers, but positioning himself where he could observe and ensure the transfers proceeded without surveillance detection. The intelligence value was accumulating. Mossad now had facial recognition data on 8 different couriers and 3 different handlers working this Istanbul route. They'd identified the cafe as a consistent transfer point. They'd documented the timing patterns, which showed operations typically occurred on Tuesday, Thursday, or Saturday afternoons between 2 and 5 o'clock. And they'd begun tracking where the couriers went after making their drops. Some flew to Germany within 24 hours of their Istanbul meetings. Others took buses to other Turkish cities. One traveled to Syria. Each movement suggested different operational networks, different target areas, different missions being coordinated through this single logistics node. But Mossad still didn't know what was being transferred. The envelopes could contain money, documents, intelligence reports, or instructions for operations. Without knowing the content, Israeli intelligence couldn't assess the threat level or determine which operations to prioritize for disruption. They needed to intercept one of the transfers, not arrest anyone, which would expose the entire surveillance operation, but physically access whatever was being passed through the dead drops. This required even more sophisticated tactics. In early May 2007, Mossad positioned an operative inside the cafe, not as a customer, which would be too visible if the person appeared repeatedly. Instead, they recruited the cafe owner through a combination of financial incentive and leverage involving tax irregularities that Turkish authorities might find interesting if anonymously reported. The cafe owner agreed to cooperate without knowing who they were really working for. They believed they were helping a European intelligence service investigate drug trafficking. They installed a small camera system that captured clear images of items left on tables. They allowed Mossad's operative to work as a part-time busboy, giving him access to tables immediately after customers departed. On May 9th, when another courier conducted a dead drop, the operative working as a busboy retrieved the newspaper before the intended recipient could collect it. He brought it to the kitchen, photographed every page with a concealed camera, then returned it to the table within 90 seconds. The intended recipient collected it 3 minutes later, never knowing the contents had been compromised. The photographs from the intercepted newspaper revealed something that Israeli intelligence hadn't fully anticipated. The envelope contained coded instructions for 3 separate operations, being planned across Europe. The codes weren't sophisticated encryption that would require supercomputers to break. They were simple substitution ciphers and numeric references that anyone with the decryption key could understand quickly. This suggested the couriers themselves weren't high-level operatives who could be trusted with complex encryption systems. They were simply messengers, moving instructions between handlers who held the actual operational knowledge. Mossad's cryptography section broke the codes within 6 hours. The first operation referenced a planned weapons transfer in Hamburg, Germany, scheduled for May 23rd. The second involved moving funds through an exchange house in Brussels to support a cell whose purpose wasn't specified in the document. The third, and most concerning, referenced a target reconnaissance mission in Paris with a completion deadline of early June. These weren't random criminal activities. These were coordinated terrorist logistics, supporting operations across 3 different countries. The intelligence gave Israel a decision point. They could alert European counterparts about the planned operations, potentially disrupting immediate threats, but also revealing that Israeli intelligence had penetrated the courier network. Or they could continue surveillance, gathering more information about the complete network structure before taking any disruptive action. The decision went up to Mossad's director level. After consultation with the Prime Minister's office, they chose a middle approach. They would share intelligence about the specific operations with European services, but they would do so through carefully constructed channels that disguised how the information had been obtained. They claimed the intelligence came from signals intercepts and a human source in Lebanon, making no mention of the Istanbul surveillance operation or Mehmet's kebab stand. This protected the operation while still allowing European authorities to act on the threat information. German police intercepted the Hamburg weapons transfer, seizing automatic rifles and explosives that were being moved from Eastern Europe for what investigators later determined was a planned attack on a Jewish community center. Belgian authorities increased surveillance on the exchange house in Brussels, identifying a Hamas financial facilitator who'd been operating there for 3 years. French intelligence intensified monitoring of known extremist individuals, looking for reconnaissance activities that matched the coded instructions. None of the European services knew these operations were connected or that they'd all been coordinated through the same Istanbul logistics hub. That information remained classified within Israeli intelligence. But disrupting these operations had consequences that Mossad had anticipated but couldn't prevent. Hamas and Hezbollah's operational security teams noticed the pattern. 3 separate operations, across 3 countries, all compromised within the same 2-week period. That wasn't coincidence. That was a security breach. Their internal investigations began immediately. They reviewed their operational procedures, looking for vulnerabilities. They interrogated operatives who'd had access to information about the compromised missions. They changed communication protocols and courier routes, assuming their networks had been penetrated. And they stopped using Istanbul for courier operations. Rashid never returned to Istiklal Street. Nassar disappeared from surveillance coverage entirely, presumably reassigned to different operational territory or pulled back to Lebanon for security review. The cafe where dead drops had been conducted saw no further suspicious activity. The entire network that Mossad had spent months mapping simply shut down and dispersed. For Mehmet, standing at his kebab grill serving customers who had no idea what role this street corner had played in international intelligence operations, the change was obvious. The pattern of couriers that had become routine simply stopped. No more nervous men with envelopes. No more careful dead drops at the cafe. No more handlers watching from strategic positions. Just ordinary tourists and Istanbul residents buying lunch. The operation had succeeded in gathering critical intelligence and disrupting immediate threats, but it had also burned the Istanbul route as an intelligence collection platform. The terrorist organizations now knew, even if they didn't know exactly how, that their Turkish operations had been compromised. They wouldn't return to the same locations or use the same methods. This is the paradox of intelligence work. Every time you use intelligence to disrupt an operation, you reveal that you have intelligence capability in that area. The adversary adapts. They change their procedures. They avoid the areas where they've been compromised, and you have to start over, building new sources, developing new methods, finding new vulnerabilities to exploit. Mossad made the calculation that stopping the immediate terrorist operations was worth sacrificing the long-term surveillance capability. 3 attacks prevented, multiple operatives identified, network mapping that would inform future operations. These were tangible results that justified the resources invested in creating and running Mehmet's street food cover. By June 2007, Mossad began planning Mehmet's extraction from Istanbul. The operational justification for maintaining his cover had diminished. The courier traffic had stopped. The terrorist organizations had abandoned this route. Keeping him in place was now higher risk than potential reward, because Hamas and Hezbollah's security investigations might eventually trace their compromises back to Istanbul and start looking at everyone who'd had proximity to their operations. But intelligence agencies don't simply pull operatives out overnight when their missions conclude. Sudden departures create their own patterns that sophisticated adversaries can detect and analyze. If Mehmet's kebab stand suddenly closed and he disappeared from Istanbul immediately after terrorist operations were disrupted, anyone investigating the security breach might make connections. So the extraction was planned as gradually and naturally as his insertion had been. Mehmet began telling his neighboring vendors and regular customers that he was having family problems back in Gaziantep. His mother was ill. He needed to spend more time there. He started closing his stand 1 or 2 days per week beyond his usual Monday closure, establishing a pattern of reduced presence. He mentioned casually that he might sell the business and return to his hometown permanently. This narrative was built over 6 weeks, creating a natural story that explained why a successful street vendor would abandon an established business. In late July, Mehmet sold the kebab stand to an actual Turkish entrepreneur who'd expressed interest in purchasing it. The transaction was completely legitimate. Money changed hands. Business licenses were transferred. The new owner took possession of all equipment and supplies. Mehmet collected his payment, said goodbye to the vendors he'd worked alongside for nearly 2 years, and took a bus to Gaziantep, where his cover story said his family lived. From there, he crossed into Syria using back channels that Mossad had established for exactly this purpose. Then into Jordan, then to a private airfield where an aircraft with false registration markings flew him back to Israel. He was debriefed for 3 weeks. Every detail of his 18 months running the kebab stand was documented. Every face he'd seen, every conversation he'd overheard, every pattern he'd noticed was recorded and analyzed. The intelligence he'd provided had directly contributed to preventing terrorist attacks and mapping networks that Israeli security services would monitor for years. And then he returned to normal duty within Mossad's operations division, where his next assignment would likely involve a completely different cover in a completely different part of the world. Because this is how intelligence work actually functions. Not through dramatic confrontations or movie-style action sequences, but through patient, methodical operations where officers spend years building covers, gathering fragments of information, and creating intelligence pictures that inform decisions about national security. The Istanbul operation demonstrated several principles that intelligence agencies study and apply across different operational contexts. First, the most effective covers aren't superficial disguises, but deep, authentic identities built through genuine activity over extended time periods. Mehmet wasn't pretending to be a street vendor. He was actually a street vendor who happened to also be collecting intelligence. Second, intelligence. Operations in denied areas require accepting higher costs and longer timelines than operations in permissive environments. 18 months of preparation to achieve several months of actual intelligence collection seems inefficient until you consider that no other method would have provided access to targets operating in territory where Israeli intelligence couldn't function openly. Third, using intelligence always involves trade-offs between immediate operational benefits and long-term collection capabilities. Disrupting the 3 European operations saved lives, but also revealed that Israeli intelligence had penetrated the Courier network, forcing the adversary to adapt. And fourth, intelligence work is ultimately about understanding human behavior and exploiting the patterns that even trained operatives can't entirely eliminate. Hamas and Hezbollah's couriers needed to eat. They needed to establish meeting locations in public spaces where they could blend into crowds. They needed consistent landmarks for coordinating their dead drops. These human requirements created vulnerabilities that Mossad identified and exploited through one of the most patient surveillance operations in modern intelligence history. Today, somewhere in Tel Aviv, there's a classified file documenting Operation Istiklal, the code name for the street food vendor operation. The file contains surveillance photographs, intelligence reports, operational assessments, and probably a few pictures of really good lamb kebabs. It represents thousands of hours of work by dozens of intelligence professionals who created and sustained an operation that most of the world will never know existed. And somewhere in Istanbul, tourists and locals still buy food from street vendors on Istiklal Street, never knowing that one of those stands was once the center of an intelligence operation that stretched across 3 continents and prevented terrorist attacks that would have killed innocent people in European cities. That's the reality of intelligence work. It happens in plain sight, hidden within the normal activities of daily life, conducted by professionals whose greatest success is that nobody ever realizes what they've accomplished.